All right. welcome. This is Dr. Chantella Sherman, and I am here once again with the Acumen Group and Acumen Magazine doing this week's Real Talk. And this is the second one for the week. I want to thank you guys so much for joining me. Um, this has been a bit of a labor of love, but it's one that I enjoy quite a bit. So, um, as always, I'm eager to present information to you guys that basically interrupts the discourse, kind of blows it apart. Those of you who are students, you understand what I mean by the discourse. Those of you who are not, it's basically a term meaning the general narrative that we give to any and everything that's going on around us that often does not include us. And by us, I mean anyone outside the normative. So that could be females, that could be Black women, that could be Black people in general, that could be anyone who's considered other. And so, as always, I'm happy to have you guys join me just for a few minutes. We're not going to take up too much time today. I've gone once again into the mailbag. For those of you who do not know, I am a historian who specializes in race, gender, specifically eugenics. And I manage what is known as the Acumen Group, which houses Acumen Magazine. And Acumen Magazine is the only African American history magazine in the country at the moment. We publish 3 times a year, and what we do is we spotlight great and wonderful information that many people don't know because whether we're in America or we're in England or we're in Amsterdam or we're in South Africa, history of people who are Black, brown skinned, considered outsiders is never included in the traditional history of the countries or the places where we are. And so as a result, a lot of times, even though we are the builders, the shapers of the nations where we live, our stories are pulled apart, dismissed, yanked out of, omitted from, or erased from the official narrative. And so it is my job as a public historian to come to you, sometimes baggy eyed and tired, but all the same excited, to spread a little information. And I go through your news emails that you send me, what we call our news bag, to ensure that I am answering directly the questions that you have. So those of you who know me know that if you get me on a tangent and we start talking good stuff, your phone will die and it'll be 4 and 5 hours later and we're still talking good stuff and we're wrapping it up. And I love that. And I do that in the tradition of Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, who was my amazing Shiro, a solid guide who still guides me to this day through many of these discussions. However, time does not permit us to do this where I just keep on talking. So instead, what I do now is I ask you to send emails to the Acumen Group, and that is Acumen Magazine 365 at Amazon. I'm saying Amazon, Jesus. That tells you how much I've been shopping. Oh my God. It's Acumen Magazine 365 at Gmail. Oh my God, I've been shopping so much on Amazon. I've actually made it part of my tag. I can't do that. Sorry. So again, Acumen Magazine 365 at gmail.com. And I go through this email probably 3 or 4 times a day and just randomly pull out. I answer all emails, but I'm actually pulling out specific information to guide us through some of the conversations that we're having about specific shows. And so this week we've been looking at Lovecraft Country. I'm not sure how many of you are watching Lovecraft Country at this point, but basically it's kind of a science fiction history lesson. um, it's all of these wonderful dramatic things pulled into one. Some place it in the space of Octavia Butler, who was an amazing science fiction writer who specialized in this transfigurative type of writing. It's a surreal type of writing where you're blending the past, the present, time travel, spiritual, different languages, all types of things, and it's all kind of thrown in together. And it's mystical and it's mythical and it's amazing. And so you get a little bit of that in Lovecraft Country, but there are a lot of historical notes that folks don't necessarily get or they get it in passing. and they want to have them kind of pulled apart. So the first session that we did, we talked a little bit about um, the concept of sundown towns. Now, if you're here in America, and I guess this may happen everywhere, but specifically in America, sundown towns continue today, and they've defined the living spaces, um, how we live, where we're allowed to live. And when I say we, I mean not just people of color, Black people, immigrants, anyone who's considered outside of, again, this American normative. I will not get into the whole eugenic stream of this because, again, that will lead me down the rabbit hole. And so we don't want to do that, but that's a whole lecture that we can get into at another point. I see Barrington Salmon, thank you so much. And Marilyn Reed, thank you so much for joining me. I know both of you, so you know how, like I said, I'll get into this and we'll be doing this and it'll be midnight. So we're going to try and keep this on point. But in the initial session that I did, we talked about the fact that you had this character, Sheriff Hunt, who basically grabs these motorists as they're going through the county, and he makes it clear to them that they are in a sundown town. And a sundown town is a place where, when nightfall comes, any person who is non-white needs to be out of that space. It goes in line with segregation, but there's very, very strategic um, placement of sundown towns. And sometimes the town is incorporated with the city, and sometimes with the entire state, entire routes where Black people, if you're anywhere in this space and sundown comes, you will be terrorized, you may come up missing, you will be violated, you may be murdered. And it became such a known and unknown space in American history that it's amazing that even as grown people now in 2020, if you were driving from one part of the country to another, you would still try and guess and gauge what would be the best places, the safest places to stop. And that would be for gas, for to go to the bathroom, to stop to eat. If you had some type of hazard on the road with your vehicle, it wasn't safe for you to stop. And sometimes it wasn't enough just to have signs that said um, whites only. Literally, whites only meant don't stop, don't even come through this way. And so we talked again about the fact that you have the Green Book, the Negro Motorist Green Book, that came about specifically because of these sundown towns and the loss of life that started to happen. You know, these sundown towns in earnest came about roughly 1890, and they continue to this day. But one of the questions that we dealt with last week was where aren't most sundown towns in the South? And the fact that the Lovecraft Country is showing a sundown town in Massachusetts, it threw a lot of people for a loop. And the understanding was that, you know, white people are racist in the South, but white supremacy exists everywhere. And so the fact that this is Massachusetts kind of opened up an entire dialogue about the fact that sundown towns exist and have existed and continue to exist all over the place. And specifically the Midwest, some Eastern towns are formidable about this. And there are great historians. There are a bunch of folks, including James Lowen. And James Lowen, you know, we talk about the fact he's a white historian, but he's tracked and he's traced sundown towns across the nation. And what he was able to find was, he still has a great website up, a database. He's connected to Tougaloo University, Tougaloo College in Mississippi. And basically, you can, you know, point, you know, on your screen to a particular state, and he'll give you a breakdown of the different cities and counties that still exist today that are still sundown towns, and why some of them are sundown towns. Now, again, as a historian, a lot of what I've done was gone back through and found the original legislation to determine when the incorporations were done for these spaces, how it was determined who would be where. And what you would find is that in many instances, sundown towns started out as spaces where blacks and whites were living in the same place. There were no issues, and through some type of insecurity, whether it was black soldiers returning from World War I, whether it was signs of Black affluence, as was the case when we started having race riots, and I would say white mob violence as opposed to race riots, because when you say race riots, it assumes that Black people were somehow attacking white people, and there was some type of contention between the two. These were generally Black people in their houses, in their neighborhoods, minding their own business on their side of town, when white mobs violently, sometimes drunkardly, came through, pillaged, burned, raped, destroyed, and ran out any and every Black denizen that was there. And so when you start having these riots, what you would find, you start having this type of violence, was that a lot of times it would be something as simple as you see a Black person has a piano being delivered. And it's an affront to a white person. And all of a sudden it becomes, how did this Negro get this? And, the mindset is, why should someone who I consider to be inferior have something that I don't have? And this hostility just kind of snowballs into a bunch of people getting together, men, women, and children, and deciding not only will we run them off, but in many instances, we will take what they leave behind. So some of these towns where the white people are living in these houses were originally owned, managed, operated, lived in, loved in by Black people who were unceremoniously and viciously run off of their own property and out of town. So that needs to be understood. And then once they're run out, they're denied access to being in that space ever again. All right. So sundown towns, in many instances, like I said, they start off as integrated spaces, in the sense that there are Black people on one side of the tracks and white people on the other side of the tracks. And we'll get into that shortly. The other thing that came out of last week's mailbag, or earlier this week, was Route 66. We talk about Nat King Cole and the fact that he had this great song about Route 66, which would take people from Missouri and the Midwest all the way over to the coast in Huron, California. But this was a vicious space for Black people to drive, because very few of the white owned and very graciously placed gas stations, service stations, rest stops, restaurants, hotels, motels, swimming pools, recreation areas. They were completely whites only. And sometimes, instead of there being signs, there would simply be a group of young people who the town assigned to make it clear to any Black people coming through, you don't belong here and we don't want you here. And going back through Black newspapers of the day, specifically the Chicago Defender, the New York Amsterdam News, the Philadelphia Tribune, you start to see articles where the editors and publishers of the newspapers are telling Black drivers, please be mindful that, the new recreation of having a car, a vehicle, and putting the family in your vehicle and traveling to different places. This is the new leisure. And it is a very middle class, very American sport. All right. To travel and have leisure in this way is dangerous when you're Black. So this concept of driving while Black, being endangered, is not new, especially in America. But there are a number of different things that happen with this. Number one, if you're traveling and you're in a nice, beautiful car, again, there are many white people all along this Route 66 that are thinking, this Negro doesn't deserve a car. They have something I don't. How do they have leisure? And I'm either no class or working class. All right. And so, again, this intimidation thing becomes one part of the issue. The second thing that comes out of the research that I found in Black newspapers were things like the beach going along the coastal area. You would think these are open spaces. But what you would find is that there were now ordinances that were being put in place, county by county or region by region, that said white sunbathers feel um, intimidated, they feel violated by having Black people look at them. Right. And when I read this, I just thought, you have to be mentally retarded or something. You have to be crazy to, to basically say your gaze, you even being in the same space where you can look at a white person, offends them. And it offends them to a point where they would rather restrict the beach, the beaches to Black people, restrict them from being able to stop in these areas, or if they are allowed to stop, they're terrorized and intimidated and interrogated by the police and citizens councils, these, normal citizens who are deputized to kind of find out where you're going and who you know, and what your aim is. And it was all done under the guise that perhaps these are Black people who are coming into town to either rape, rob, steal, or destroy what was in those white spaces. And so once again, it makes the adventure and the leisure, the love of travel for Black people, it kind of sullies the space in a way where you're trying to figure out what's going on with this. This is not quite the American dream. And it basically constricts them to a different type of space. So again, why were sundown towns needed? Um, in earnest, again, because many white people felt intimidated about seeing Black people with anything, especially anything that made them look American, like citizens, patriotic, enjoying again the spoils of having lived well and worked well and saved up. It just seemed as if these people weren't supposed to have the same things that white people had, or things that white people were striving to earn or striving to get that hadn't yet been able to attain. And then you see a Black person who you believe should not have it. And a lot of Black people were stopped because they were believed to be thieves. Did you steal this car? Where did you get it? Where could a Negro get this type of money? And so we see this in pop culture a lot, but to see it kind of um, come to the screens with Lovecraft Country was amazing. To see this young man and the folks in the car trying to get across the county line, and they're literally chasing the son, but can't go over the speed limit because the sheriff is directly behind them, and then he's ramming their car to almost force them off the road, to force them to have to stop. And when he realizes that they're not going to, he's not going to be able to stop them in that way. What the folks in the car don't realize is that these are counties that are connected, and all of them are sundown towns. All right. So once again, if you happen to be in DC and you go to Newmark, you go to the National Museum for African American History and Culture, what you're going to find is that they have an exhibit, an interactive exhibit that's set up specifically that looks at the Green Book. And Hugo Green, the creator, and his wife, they were amazing in literally going to these places stop by stop, county by county, mile by mile, and trying to determine what would be a safe place to be, what would be a safe place to stop. And many times being bullied, abused, injured for the information that they did place in these guides. And so the guide ran from 1936 to 1966. Unfortunately, today, many of the places that were listed in the Green Book are no longer in existence because as integration came through, these Black businesses were sidestepped by Black people um, um, because they wanted to integrate into these other spaces. Now, as we push forward, if you guys have questions now, please go ahead and put them in the comment section, and I'll also answer them as we go through. One of the other things that came out of the last session was the concept of Anna, and Anna Town. Sometimes instead of saying whites only, there would be signs that just said Anna, ANNA, and that stood for Ain't No Niggers Allowed. Okay. And so if you ever saw Anna, and you may see them today, if you ever see ANNA on a sign that can be small, it's not a big billboard. It's an understanding from the people who are in that town to let you know this is a place where Black people are not allowed, they're not wanted, and they're really not welcome. All right. But how do you keep an Anna town and Anna town? And so when we get to the third episode of Lovecraft Country, we pick up the same story about um, contested spaces, living spaces. Once again, when Letitia, um, Journey Smollett, decides she wants to purchase a house in an all white neighborhood. And so all of a sudden, an Anna community becomes a contested space. And so um, redlining is one thing, but one of the questions that came up with in the mailbag, they're talking about redlining. It's like, well, was redlining being done in the 1950s when Lovecraft Country is supposedly filmed? Yes, is the quick and easy answer. And actually, what I would tell you is, when you start having city planners and developers, whether it was 1880 or 1980, A lot of times, the first thing they started to do was look at the land and look at the value of the land. And the value of the land in terms of, were there issues with shifting dirt? Where there issues, if you're in Mississippi, issues of red clay, where you're going to have to make the foundation of the building go so far down in order to keep the building and the dirt itself from shifting or having water seep into it and then destroy the foundation of the house and make it crack. There are all types of logistical things that go into planning houses and developing and planning towns. And so, what I started doing once again in doing the actual research and going through logistical notes for places like Atlanta, for instance, what you would find is that the city developers went through, found the best places to live, the ones with the best agricultural spaces, the most sturdy for development, serious long term development, and they basically X them out for whites only. At the same time, in going through the paperwork, and this is readily available. So, those of you who want the additional information, please also just email me, and I'll make sure that you get the actual reports that were done in 1890, 1902, 1915 for Atlanta specifically. But you have basically the city planner who says we cannot find a reason for ever giving great property, good property, or even decent property to a Negro if there's even one white person that can benefit from that property. All right. So when you're legally telling folks, all right, this is how we're going to plan this out, it goes into, a lot of things that we talked about in another film, The Banker, where you have black people who have the money. They want to purchase property, but they're basically told, no, you can't get it. Even if you want to pay the entire house in cash, pay for it in cash, you're not allowed in these spaces. And so, rather than saying whites only or Anna, um, you know, you do things with the banking community to ensure that these folks are restricted from being in these spaces. And so some of the things that come up with redlining, how does redlining work? And how do you keep a white neighborhood white? There are restrictive covenants that are in place, not only with banking institutions that say once a black person has moved into a property, the value of that property has now diminished by 50%. The neighbors surrounding them have now also had their property diminished, devalued by 50 to 75% based on the fact that you have one black family who's moved into that neighborhood. Okay. So you start looking at the white neighbors and saying, they have as far as they're concerned, a legitimate reason to not want these black people here because, again, white people's water isn't colder, their grass isn't greener, and they're not sitting on top of money. They're poor, broken, lonely. They're striving and saving money and doing everything that every other American is doing. So if they're working to maintain a house and they're now told that with this one black family that moves into this property, their property and everything that they've built in their homes is now diminished by 50 to 75%, they decide they're going to get together and do things like one, we're going to have a citizens or neighborhood council where we sign off on different terms where we say if at any point we decide to leave this neighborhood, we will not, we will not ever sell it to a Negro, a Spanish person, any non-white person. All right. That is written into the language of the documents they sign off on in order to own the land and the property. They will never rent their properties to anyone other than a white person. So we've had instances where black families would come in and say, I have the full amount of money. I don't need a bank loan, so I'm going to sidestep the bank. I don't need to get approval from the neighborhood council or anyone else. We're able to move directly in. What would happen? They could actually get into the neighborhood. They could actually get into the house. But once they're in there, you see what you saw in Lovecraft Country, this third episode, where the neighbors basically intimidate and turn on the people in the house, where they're either laying on their horns all night long, putting bricks, tying bricks to the horns, so that the horns are just going off on their cars all night long, so the people in the house can never get any peace or rest. Breaking into the houses, throwing Molotov cocktails through the house. Now, here's the thing that you don't want to destroy the actual house if you can avoid that, because you still don't want the value of your house diminished by having a damaged house there, even if you can run the people off. Um, Getting into the house or tearing up the house from, when they know that the neighbors have gone, the owners have gone. Pillaging through the house. Anytime the neighbors come out for anything, pelting them with rocks, doing anything that they can do to intimidate these people to get them off the block and out of that house. And so what you end up having, burning crosses on the lawns. And so what you end up having in many instances are Black people who, through pressure and intimidation, leave their homes. They're still responsible for paying for this house, but all of a sudden, for their own protection, they have to leave the houses that they're in, for their own safety. And so these restrictive covenants and this intimidation is nonstop, is ongoing. If you're in the DC metropolitan area, it was just found again, through this website, Dr. Lowen's website, that Silver Spring, Maryland, not too far from where the City Place shopping mall is, it used to be an Anna space. And so if you were non-white, the white people there would actively run you out. And maybe 3 or 4 years ago, you actually had the mayor come through and offer an apology to at least two families who had been run out of two Black families who had been run out of the neighborhood in the 1960s. And so this is an ongoing type of issue. So as we push forward with some of this stuff, again, banking institutions are responsible in many instances. Um, if you're in a space where you have Black leaders, you say, how do you have Anna Towns and restrictive covenants in places where you have Black city council members, Black mayors, Black police chief, Black bankers? And the reality is, if you've been told, and it's been pushed into the legislation, and the way that these leases, and the way that the mortgages are written, that once again, Black people just have a lower value on the loan scale. So I'm not going to give you as much money for your loan in order to pay off the house, or to get the loan, or I'm going to inflate the rates at which you have to pay the loan back, or I'm going to devalue the house from the start. I'm going to elevate the value on paper, but then make it clear that it's devalued in a way that once you get it, you will never get the money off of this house the way it should be. So in that way, the American dream, in many instances where home ownership is supposed to be the gateway to the middle class and the pinnacle for, upper class status and all this other stuff, it actually becomes just a reservoir. It's a money pit, because the value of it changes based on the fact that you are a Black person. And so for those of you who were watching The Bankers, we did the popular eugenics series, and we were looking at the movie The Bankers. If you can get a hold of it and watch that, please do. But The Bankers is dealing with two Black men who go in pretending to be the janitor, but they actually own the bank, and they're able to buy property in white neighborhoods. And as white people, through white flight, decide to leave the neighborhood, instead of the value of the property going down, it goes up, because they start buying additional property until they have entire neighborhoods. They fix the buildings in such a way where middle class Black people move in, and it brings a certain level of stability across the board. The value of the homes, the value of the houses, the value of the property in general goes up. At some point, they get into trouble because they enlist the help of a white male to pretend to be one of their partners or whatever, because they physically have to be in a space where they don't want it known that they are Black people who own the very building where all of the white banks are housed. I mean, it's an amazing story, and it's based on a real life story. So the men were eventually arrested, and charges of fraud and some other things were brought against them. In the beauty that is America, these men served, a few years in jail, but they had actually put aside enough property and enough investments that by the time that they came out of prison, they were able to maintain their status as Black millionaires, through real estate investments and things like that. So it's imperative again that we understand some of the things that we're dealing with right now when we're talking about, you know, white people have 80 times more wealth than black people. I'm always telling people you need to look at the reality of how wealth is built in this nation and then understand it's not based upon the fact that black people are somehow inferior or don't understand how money works or all of these other things that are kind of placed on folks as a race trait. If anything, what you say is this type of systemic racism where just the fact that I'm a black female going in, trying to purchase property or invest, you will automatically give me a different um, value. You'll give me different information. You'll lead me into a certain area where you know I'm going to get less than, I'm going to pay more, and it is not going to be the same value to me that it would be to someone who is white and male. Okay. And so based on that, we have to be really, really clear. As we stay in the Lovecraft country, and you start to again break down the show itself, there are a lot of things about these whites only neighborhoods that become more and more clear. Just, you see the scene where, Letitia is banging up the people's car. She gets really fed up. She tears up the people's car. She knocks the bricks off the horns and she goes through all of this. But immediately, every black person that's connected to that house knows when the police are looking for them and not the white people. So they immediately put their hands on their head, they're on their knees, and she's arrested. And so you have to understand that law enforcement, in many instances, and they were working in tandem with the neighborhood because the violation was number one, these black people should not have been there. And a lot of times, if a black family was moving in, they had to move in after dark when no white people are watching them. And again, I've read stories where the owners of the houses pretended to be the maids or the butlers of the house rather than making it clear and known starting out that they were, in fact, the actual owners of the house. All right. So I think that's the only other question that I have from the mailbag. Let me double check this again. If you have questions, please drop them into um, the little comment section there, and I'll get to you really, really quick. Okay. Um, Yeah. So again, just the idea of generational wealth, that was something else. I think I kind of touched on that, but the concept of generational wealth is lost um, because many blacks were pushed into neighborhoods with inadequate property values and little to no home equity. And so based on that, generational wealth is about that house escalating in value as it goes up. And then when other development comes in around it, it has even more value. And so you're able to send your kids to college based off the value of the houses, the school system surrounding your kids from K to 12 is based upon the value of the houses. So if I'm in an area where the houses have been devalued, despite the fact that they look the exact same as the houses where the white people live, and again, if you're in DC, you understand this. If you're on one side of Rock Creek Park, the houses are the same as the houses on the opposite side of Rock Creek Park, but they're separated by value, which is generally separated by skin color. And so if you're on one side and you're headed towards Connecticut Avenue and Wisconsin Avenue and Foxhall Road, the values of those houses is astronomical. All right. The school systems show the difference. All right. If you're on the opposite side and you're headed towards 14th Street and 7th Street, the value of the exact same houses made the exact same way by the exact same developers is sometimes a third of what they are on this opposite side. All right. Same city, separated by maybe a mile, if that, of Parkway. That's it. So it's very, very important when we start talking about generational wealth, and a lot of you have talked a bit about in some of the sessions about building wealth and creating wealth and susus and all of these other things. Understand that if you do not have someone in the banking industry and that understands mortgages, that understands how property The value of it shifts and changes based on race, then you do yourself a disservice. With everything, you have to do your research and you have to do your homework. I heard someone say in the 1940s, if you wanted property and you were a black female, what you did was befriend an older white male, put your money in his hand, and send him to go buy the property. And that would be the only way. If you needed a car, find an older white male to go do your bidding, and and it sounds derogatory and offensive in so many ways in 2020. But if the same systems are in place and we haven't fought readily and actively to really, break them apart. I mean, we've banged on them and we've chipped away at certain things, but as a whole, the core is still in its place. So the same things that our grandparents were fighting about with these systems, as far as gaining access to and then maintaining these properties and holding on to them and not being pushed out. So we don't necessarily have, white supremacists running through with torches and guns, running people out of neighborhoods now. What you do have is gentrification, which is another type of intimidation where you're forcing people out in the very same way. All right. So again, it's looking at this and understanding that pop culture is showing you real life sometimes, and then real life is dictating what pop culture is showing you. When you see these things on screen, I don't care what the vehicle is, you need to stop, take note, look it up, research it. If the research gets too heavy for you, then you email me and we can kind of work on it that way. But the information is there. A lot of times what we're doing is trying to reinvent the wheel, and we're over here trying to learn how to make bullets. The bullets are already made. What you need to do is figure out how your grandparents and your great grandparents worked the system that they're in, because the system really isn't changing. White supremacy is still white supremacy. Depravity is still depravity. The things that these guardrails that keep you from being in spaces, this otherness, this lack of access, this thing of being kept out of spaces, it's still very much the same. So I would encourage you once again, because Lovecraft Country is what we're kind of screening through this week. If you have time for the rest of the week, go back through, read through. And there are books that go to Lovecraft Country. This was originally a book series before it was a television series. Watch, read, take note, kind of see where you are with this. See if you can find the understanding. A lot of things are hidden in books. And the saying that, you want to hide something from a black person, put it in a book, it's there. It's there. And I don't mind reading and deciphering, but I'd like for you to read along with me. And then where some people have made it a bit easier and put it in film, we can watch and we can pull it apart and kind of see where we are and then come up with plans so that we can execute strategically how we will fight these things so that our children and our grandchildren aren't going back trying to do the exact same things all over again. All right. So, again, if there are any questions, I'll take those. Um, okay, I got Barrington. Howard Town still allowed to operate sundown towns in 2020. Again, Barrington, this is, it's about the value at this point. And so if if I have the sheriff and I have the governor and I have the citizens who are intimidating people as they're going through, if I happen to get away from these folks, who do I tell? And so the reason why you knew these were sundown towns years ago is because someone who was going through, who survived it and made it out, told someone federally in a federal space, okay, this is what's going on. And that's how you start getting the Holiday Inn and the Ramada Inns and the Red Roofs and the whatever else is. And so that way, you start having the interstate that would go past some of these places and offer alternatives to it. In many ways, and I'm not particularly sad that it happened, it ran a lot of these white mom and pop businesses out. It just ran them out. And so it's like good. So if you segregated, you want to stay segregated. Now you only have your own folks to deal with. The Best of Enemies is a movie that came out not too long ago. Taraji P. Henson is in it. It's a remarkable film. I think one of the best films I've seen in a number of years that kind of gets to the crux of how black and white relationships in southern spaces, well, I would just say in spaces that are kind of off the grid. So you would say um, a poor white man who owns a gas station, he needs business, but he won't allow any of the black people that are in the town to be serviced at his station. Why? Because that would mean that a white man is serving a black man. So he would rather his kids, they're half going hungry. One of them is in a an institute because he has Down syndrome or something. He's mentally, he's in a space, an asylum, and he needs money to keep the kid there. All of this other stuff. But this is the grand wizard cyclops of the clan, and it's white this, white that, and white the other. And he makes a point. He says, "I was no one until the clan took me in. Poor, ignorant, didn't have anything. The clan took me in, and all of a sudden, I belonged to something." So at some point, when he starts to realize, the clan is not what it's supposed to be. I really need to do something else. I don't want to do this anymore. And he tears up, I'm giving you spoilers, I'm sorry. He tears up his clan membership card. The white people decide, again, the only thing worse than a nigga is a nigga lover. And for those of you again who don't know me, I don't I don't need you to brace yourself with some of the terms I'm using. White folks have no problem saying nigger, and I really don't either. All right. I'm a fan of Paul Mooney's and Richard Pryor's, and I think you meet people where they are. So this is kind of where I am with this. All right. I'm not, I don't need you to shudder every time I say this, but um basically, the white people in town try and burn down the gas station. He puts it out or whatever, but then he realizes he now has all of the patronage of the black people in the town. So he actually is able to survive off of the money he was denying himself all along. And so white people have always had to make that decision. You're either on the side of whiteness, meaning you're cutting your own throat. You're denying yourself access to the economy of all of these black people. You need what they have, but so you have to choose. So again, when you're talking sundown towns, Barrington, you're literally looking at people now who are still trying to hold on to white supremacy as opposed to holding, because as far as they're concerned, the American dream failed them and their parents and their grandparents in 1865. It was a wrap then. Okay. And so at this stage of the game, it's like we've created a space that is ours and we will hold on to this for dear life. And if that means we don't want universal health care because it means the Negroes are going to also have health care and we don't want them to have that. We don't want them to have what we have. All right. Then you'd rather be sick than to be well. But you're holding on to white supremacy. You don't want a black person in your community or at your school, but the black kids' test scores are actually higher than the rural kids in the neighborhood where you are, your own folks' test. So the school would do better by having the black kids there than than not. But your belief is if the black kids and the white kids are in the same space, there's going to be some mixing, and then we're going to have a bunch of mixed race kids and da da da. So they're back to this white supremacist idea, where again you have to choose whiteness over common sense, and it doesn't make sense. But as we go into this election, you also see how we're not talking about people who want to vote in their own best interests. What they're voting right now are their emotions. And since their emotions are flip flopping, it doesn't matter that they're in the fire right now. They're more concerned with not having someone who's connected to that black guy who was the president and the black woman who may also be Native American and some other things as a potential president of the nation in the White House. They don't want that. And so, a lot of times you have to, kind of figure out where people are mentally. I say read a good history book. Go back and find Nell Painter. I love her. The history of white people in the US. Go back and find White Trash, Nancy Eisenberg. Black history, we know who we are. We're good. All right. We need to figure out who the people are that we share space with. And I'm not talking about these things that we encounter every day. I'm literally talking about how this nation was founded, how other nations were founded, what keeps us having issues of segregation, sundown towns, all of these things that were said in 1920 are being said again in 2020. And what I want people to understand is no one ever stopped saying it. No one ever stopped. We stopped listening, we stopped hearing it. But the folks who crafted this never stopped saying it. All right. For everything that you do, where it looks like equity is there, the balance is there. There is always an answer in a white supremacist space to knock it over. All right. So if you have the March on Washington, but we don't look at the March on Washington, we said, all right, we're moving in the right direction. That very Sunday was what? The bombing of the church in Birmingham. All right. There's an answer to everything. You didn't just have Brown versus the Board of Education. You didn't have Brown. All right. Brown versus the Board of Education, right. Look like you won. All right. We have equity. Immediately you had white school systems, entire towns, entire cities that said, based on the fact that the Supreme Court has ruled that black and white kids should be in the same schools, we'll shut the school down. We won't even let the kids go to school for a whole year. All right. We'd rather our kids not go to school. They can sit home. All right. We'll self teach, but we refuse to follow the directive that the nation has made. All right. So you have to understand that for every policy that's made, there's an equal and opposite policy under white supremacy that's there. And again, I think with some of these films, what you start to see is that even white people who are trying to do the right thing, they find that they're under sometimes equal and greater duress than the black people because now these people are white people are considering them to be race traitors. All right. And again, there used to be a commercial that came out, and I think I saw this once when I was in either Duncan or Shelby, Mississippi. And it's weird. As a child, I remember this visiting, and it was like a radio spot or a television commercial that came on really, really late at night. And I'm hearing this, not seeing it. But again, it said the only thing worse than a nigger, and there was a pause, is a nigger lover. I never understood where the ad came from, what exactly it was talking about. It had to be 1978, 79, right in there. So I'm thinking, we're past all of the Jim Crow stuff at this point. So I'm not exactly sure where that was or what the context of it was. But it was a regular ad that came on the entire time I was visiting. All right. So if you're still having the same issues going forward that your grandparents and your great grandparents had, the question is, what are we going to do about it now? What concrete things can we do? And I think again with the bankers, we talked about the fact that you can always, we have black banks, we have black schools, we have courses that can be taken so that you learn how to finance and save money and do collective and collaborative type of things where you're not beholding to the system. Now, the system works in some instances and in some ways. It absolutely does. Now, in places where it needs to be fixed or there are cracks that need to be filled in or things that we need to absolutely blow up and pull apart, you have to figure out a way of doing this. All right. And it can't be something that is so destructive that it also destroys you in the process. All right. So I think again, this is just a matter of us trying to figure out as we're again watching different things on television and we're reading different books and we're trapped inside with COVID-19 and whatever foolishness that's about to take place come November and we get through these election cycles and all of that. We need to have some really, really serious and concrete discussions about where we are as a nation, as a diasporic nation, um, because many of the things that we're dealing with here in America are also being dealt with in other spaces in the exact same ways. So we're going to have to learn how to get over language barriers and cultural differences and whatever else to understand that white supremacy looks the same everywhere. We're the only ones trying to figure out if you like the people over there because you don't believe in the religion that they believe in, and you don't like the way they do their hair or the food they eat or blah, 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 blah. White supremacy looks like white supremacy in every place you go. So the question is, how do you manage that, and how do you deal with getting around some of these things, and in getting through them, and turning that cycle over, turning these systems over, turning them over on their sides if need be. All right. So if there are no other questions, all right, we've actually done this in roughly 50 minutes, which for me is a good record time. It won't be midnight when we finish. Again, if you have emails that you want to send, Acumen Magazine 365 at gmail.com, not Amazon. And please send messages through the messenger systems on Facebook. Send me a message on Facebook, Dr. Chantella, anytime. I'm happy to answer. If you have different films, Crystal, thank you for coming through. Crystal Mincy knows that if there are TV shows that you're watching and you have questions about them, or you have things that you want me to take a look at to kind of get my opinion on them, send them to me. This is part of what I do, and deconstruct these things so that I can kind of give you a gauge of what it is that you're watching. Again, guys, please be mindful that as we're trapped inside, we're streaming television more and more. We're streaming constantly. And what we ingest visually has the same type of impact on us as what we ingest with food. All right. We have to be extremely careful about what we intake. We're having all types of emotional upheaval. Watching certain things is impeding our digestion, our sleep, and just our common sense in some instances. And so we have to be mindful of what it is that we're watching. And when we have a reaction to something, we need to be able to stop, take note of it, and ask questions about why that's making me angry. Why am I crying over this when maybe should be laughing, or it's meant to be a joke, but I'm not finding it funny? We're still able to hold people accountable. And we don't get to say the industry or the government. We get to say the individual people's names within the government and within the media to hold them accountable for a reason. All right. We have to do our due diligence if we're going to be a part of this. All right. It's been wonderful having you here with me. Again, I am Dr. Chantella Sherman with the Acumen Group and Acumen Magazine. Feel free to visit the website www.theacumengroup.org. Check out what we're doing, looking at different television shows, always a bunch of great themes on eugenics. Those of you who have sent me messages about eugenics and the sterilization processes that have come up with this quote unquote whistleblower this past week. We may get into that at some point in October. I want to let this flush out so that we can actually see what's happened with that. I'm going to continue. We're going to continue watching Lovecraft Country. However, it's kind of going in some different places right now, and I've had a couple of suggestions for next week's sessions that I'm not particularly happy about. But I do want to discuss next week Antebellum. All right. Have we had enough slave movies? Is this a slave movie? Is it something that's surreal? Is it science fiction? Is it horror? What are the messages that are trying to be conveyed with Antebellum? And so, those of you who don't know, find a trailer for Antebellum. Let me know what you think. Antebellum will most likely be the next thing that we discuss this coming week on Thursday. Thursday? Yes, Thursday. All right. And so we'll pull everything together. If you have, again, other topics that you want to discuss, please hit me up and let me know. All right. With that, thank you so much for joining me. I'm grateful and I'm blessed to have you with me. And I'll see you next time.